We will go ahead and get started with our third seminar in the Sustainable Ed virtual seminar series. My name is Matt Kraft, and I'm the founder and faculty director of Sustainable Ed. Sustainable Ed is a new initiative at Brown University's Annenberg Institute, which aims to advance evidence, evidence-based efforts to create more resilient and sustainable schools. We accomplish this by conducting policy relevant research, translating evidence into actionable insights, and serving as a national hub for cross-sector collaboration. And today it is my distinguished pleasure to invite and welcome Dr. Hunter Gehlbach to give his virtual seminar on the global challenge of teaching about environmentalism, climate change, and planetary health. Dr. Gehlbach is a professor of education at Johns Hopkins University, is the co-director of education for the Johns Hopkins Institute for Planetary Health, and a former high school teacher. And without further ado, I'll turn it over.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate the warm introduction. So good to be here. Yeah, really excited today for the conversation. I think education just has so much to offer in this space of thinking about the environment, climate change, and kind of, as I will refer to it, planetary health. So yeah, if we can dive in at like the biggest picture possible. I think modern day education is in a really interesting spot. So I think as we've got sort of the rise of AI, all of a sudden, gosh, like content knowledge is really easy to acquire. Like, do we need to spend tons of time thinking it or teaching students like lots and lots of content? Maybe. I certainly have a colleague who thinks that. I'm a little more skeptical. Procedural knowledge, same thing. Logical problem solving, like these all seem like the kinds of things that AI is really good at. And so as we look around and think about like what is it that students need to know, um, you know, gosh, we've gone so crazy for STEM knowledge recently, but like I kind of feel like AI is gonna help us do a really good job of STEM very soon, if not already. Certainly, no one wants to teach their kid coding, how to do coding anymore. And so, if we look around, what should we be teaching? I think you got to look at the world's big problems, and I think disproportionately, the world's problems are the big ones are really interdisciplinary. They are much more interpersonal and intercultural. So sort of think social science maybe rather than hard science. And the scope is just vast. So they're kind of indeterminate in time, scope, and causality. And so I realize that's super abstract, but like I'm thinking about things like immigration, right? Certainly lots and lots of different disciplines that can kind of contribute to and comment on that massive sort of interpersonal and intercultural dimensions to it. Like, seems like it's going to be a challenge on into the future. The scope of it is massive as we declare wars in certain parts of the world. We've got numbers of places that are harder and harder to eke out a living in. Public health pandemics, I would say, is another one of the world's kind of big problems. But maybe the biggest one of all, whether you want to call it climate change or environmentalism, planetary health is the term I'll use, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I would argue that is maybe the most important domain for education to dive into, to really embrace, and to think about. And so that's part of the reason I'm obviously very animated and excited to talk today. So what the heck is human health? I guess for an official definition, the sort of textbook says it's a solutions-oriented transdisciplinary field and social movement focused on analyzing and addressing the impacts of human disruptions to Earth's natural systems on human health and all life. That is a huge mouthful. And so I am not sure I can process all that at the same time. And so I like to break it down a little bit more. So to me, step number one, it's an orientation that's saying, look, our human health depends completely upon the planet's health. If the planet's not healthy, we're not healthy. It is also really committed to thinking about solutions. And that, I think, makes it much more appealing as we think about teaching it, particularly to students. It, for I think fairly obvious reasons, focuses a ton on systems thinking. And so the old notion that the ankle bone is connected to the elbow bone is that whole idea is kind of on steroids in planetary health, right? All these systems are deeply interconnected and dependent on one another. This I find really interesting. Like, it is absolutely a field of scientific study, and we can find out empirical findings about what makes the planet healthier or not healthy when these Earth systems fall out of balance. But it's also a social movement, right? We love to see more people putting pressure on public officials to try to prioritize planetary health to a greater degree than typically has happened in the past. There's a big premise involved in planetary health, which is that humans have caused the very problematic disruptions to nature's systems that we're now experiencing all the repercussions of on pretty much a daily basis. And then finally, last thing I'll mention here is that embedded deep into sort of the ethos of planetary health is a really strong social justice, ecological justice angle. And so it's thinking as a field, it is thinking deeply about issues of kind of equity and fairness. A lot of people I do find sort of ask, like, wait, why? Oh my gosh, Hunter, really, like, planetary health? Like, why can't we talk about it as climate change education or environmental science? Like, that's kind of already a course in a lot of high schools. And it's not the biggest battle to pick for me, but I do think planetary health makes a lot of sense as I've sort of come to know it and embraced it more, as opposed to like environmentalism or climate change education. And so one reason why I think it's sort of a useful vision and approach to thinking about education in this space is that there are so many prongs from which educators could motivate learners. And so there's absolutely an altruistic, like, it is just the right thing to do to work to make the planet healthier and to pull some of these natural systems back into alignment and back how they're a more healthy balance in nature. There's a huge, it's going to take a massive sort of collective effort. And so there's a really huge social connectedness part. And we know from motivation literature that, being social is a huge motivation for people. Nature itself is intrinsically motivating. Like, we're finding more and more research to indicate that people are happier and healthier the more that they spend time in nature. And then of all of those, though, I think the thing that, and I don't love saying this, but I do feel like the self-interest thing is huge, right? Oh, wait, if the planet's not healthy, I personally am not going to be healthy. And so as we're thinking about sort of motivational levers to try and get people invested, I think planetary health as kind of a framing offers some big advantages over things like climate change. And then the maybe final thing I'll say, and we'll get on to the main part of the show. I do think the term is a lot less polarized, right? If you talk about climate change politically in this country, certain people are going to categorize you immediately and dismiss you. Other people are going to categorize you and say, aha, you're on my team. Planetary health, you throw that term out, and most people are like, wait, what? I mean, I get the words, but like, how do you mean that? And then you're into a conversation, which I think is a really much more productive way to sort of start. So, with that sort of background and setup, let's dive in. So, to me, I think one of the things that is particularly exciting, having been in schools of education, kind of my whole professional career, is just thinking through, on the one hand, how much I think education can and I hope will offer in terms of contributions to planetary health education. It kind of emerged out of the public health space, but I think it is a massive educational challenge to think about. Gosh, everyone on the planet needs to know about this stuff. So how do we get all learners up to speed on the connections between human health and the health of the planet? I opened with sort of like thinking about kind of more modern educational challenges. So get the entire globe uh, up to speed on at least some basics of how the planet's health impacts their own personal health. So that is one of a handful of features. I think other ones that make this, really different than like algebra or Spanish or English literature. So we've got a much bigger target audience. Second, I think we've got way different ways of thinking than how we usually do. And so these new sort of sets of cognitions that we're going to have to introduce learners to and get them up to speed on, I think makes a really, really different field of study. Third, I know a lot of math teachers. I don't know a single one for whom, when they were out there teaching math, some student stood up in the middle of class and said, hey, that quadratic equation thing, I think that's fake news. I don't believe it at all. It's a hoax. By contrast, environmental science teachers and folks teaching planetary health deal with a ton of misinformation. And so that really makes teaching in this subject area or education in this subject area very, very different. Emotions. I'm going to pick on math yet again. Totally get it. Like it is, yes, like some students get really anxious, like test anxiety in math, totally a thing. But there is a big qualitative difference between, yes, I'm really worried about the quiz on Friday, and existential angst because the planet is melting and I don't know what that means for my, livelihood, well-being, and future. So that's something else that educators are really going to have to take into account. Fifth thing, motivation for collective action. So it's really, I think, rare that we think, at least in the educational system I grew up with, K to really 16 and beyond, that we're thinking about training students to take action, much less collective action. And so that feels like a very different kind of characteristic of what we're talking about here from an educational lens. And then last one, urgency versus complexity versus equity. So we got to solve this problem quickly, but man, it's a complicated problem. And so, silver bullet, one shot solution kinds of things are almost certainly not on the table. And it's going to take time to figure it all out. But then we also don't want to perpetuate these, equity and fairness problems that we've had, particularly around like the people who have caused the problem are disproportionately not the people who are feeling the worst effects. And so how do we operate at the intersection of these three things? Like that's a big tension. So where I'd love to go is to walk us through sort of these 6 things that I think really make planetary health education, kind of unique and challenging, um, and lead us into a conversation at the end, hopefully sooner than later, about what should educators be doing? And we'll talk about educators in a super broad way, but what should they be doing to improve the planet's health? And so a lot of this is coming from an article that is in preprint form right now that I'm really excited about. And so we'll touch on a bunch of things from the article, but we'll also I'll digress into some stuff that's not in there. So hopefully it's some value added in that sense. So that's kind of the end and the beginning, and I think let's go ahead and dive into these sort of 6 facets, and hopefully they'll sort of build up and give us a sense of like, oh, okay, this is kind of how to characterize what's unique and challenging about educating people in this space. And then would, gosh, love to open up the conversation and pick your brains about how do we do that well. So, as mentioned, I think one of the biggest crazy challenges is that we got to hit everyone. Every single person on the globe needs to be a student or a learner about planetary health education. And so that has real implications for folks in higher education, right? So there's lots and lots of different disciplines that need to contribute, whether it's psychology or public health or engineering to build cities or business school and so on and so forth. There's really kind of a myriad of professions that can contribute. There's also a ton of roles that can contribute, like, yes, I am a father, but I'm also a voter. So in that role, what am I doing to support planetary health? But the big thing, and maybe it's because I've been in higher ed for too long now, is that these professions in particular are really going to have to collaborate. And so I don't know, maybe this seems obvious, but like, if we think about a much broader array of like educators to include things like journalists, like they're educating the public all the time, CEOs, everyone in the company is gleaning lots and lots of information from the CEO about kind of the right way to do things. Architects making green cities. So tons and tons of professions in some portion of their job have, I think, an obligation to think about educating people that they work with about how important it is to keep the planet healthy, because otherwise our personal health is going to suffer. And then, again, not only do they have to do that, but in interacting with other professions, other people in other roles, everyone's got to be able to figure out ways to play nice in the same sandbox together. One of the reasons, so in part, I think the target audience of planetary health education is literally everyone, because the health of the planet is a collective effort, a team sport, if you will. But I think the other reason is because of the urgency of the problem, we really need to graduate students, as we think about sort of more traditional, maybe K to 16 education. We've got to graduate them into a world where people are at least receptive to the idea of prioritizing the planet's health. And so what I want to do as we sort of walk through these 6 unique characteristics is leave you with a little provocation and kind of idea, right? It is a solutions focused field of study. And so leave you with a little provocation, a little hint of what, not a solution, but a little hint of a solution might be. And so I was so excited when I stumbled upon this article. So this study sort of used, I think it was middle school students, and sent them home. And part of the assignment was like, hey, talk to your parents about planetary health. And lo and behold, they collected a bunch of data from the kids, from the parents, and parents' attitudes, particularly, and this was, I think, largely targeting, I think a lot of it was in or maybe the whole study was in North Carolina, sort of rural, more conservative. And so not a group that was likely predisposed to sort of believe in climate change too much. And particularly the girls with their fathers, they got parents nudging more toward valuing the planet's health or believing in climate change. And so I think as we as educators think about like, you know, educating all learners, that's impossible. How could I do that? Like I only teach the kids in my class. I think here's a really interesting approach where kids then port some of that stuff they're learning in class out into the world in a way that yeah, spreads the education of how important the planet's health is. All right. So there it is. One thing that makes Planetary Health unique. We got to touch all learners. Second thing is there going to be some really new ways of thinking that we got to wrap our minds around. So from an educational standpoint, I mean, gosh, kind of exciting in a lot of ways. So systems thinking is certainly one of the big kind of headline ones. Um, so what do I mean by that? Well, a couple of things. Mostly we're talking about like really interrelated ecosystems and natural systems in the world. But I think in some ways, right, we've all heard the aphorism like, you know, butterfly flaps its wings in China, and then, you know, all these ripple effects. So we kind of know that's a thing, but we don't know how to think through that space. And I think increasingly we want to really be able to think about that. And so Nisbet and Miyamoto have this whole notion of like contrasting Eastern thought and Western thought, and you know, sort of more American Western, like that way of thinking really focuses on actors and people and individuals and the thing doing the action as opposed to the broader context. And so maybe one example of how we shift at least the educational system in this country toward more of a systems thinking kind of approach is to think about the ground and the background and the context. So that's one piece of the puzzle. I think, you know, we love to think about cause and effect, and, you know, PowerPoint has lots of, you know, we're going to have a flow chart and arrows, but man, so much of the real world, it's a multi-causal kind of place. It's really hard to imagine that we're going to do a great job of solving, you know, some of these planetary health challenges if we stay in that kind of, you know, cause effect mode as opposed to like it being a multi-causal world, for example. Okay. And so that's one new way of thinking. A second new way of thinking, I think, as a just sort of like general almost a thought thinking disposition, right? A mental orientation. So indigenous ways of knowing have some really great insights here, I think. And if you read any of that literature, one kind of lovely way of framing it that I stumbled upon is just transforming how we think about things as people being a part of nature, not apart from nature. And so there's sort of some actual, you know, the cognitive approach we take to things. We got to get some exposure to new ways of thinking. But then there's also just sort of the dispositional orientation and almost attitude that we take towards how we think about the subject area. Huge challenge in this, you know, gosh, all right, we've got these really new, different ways of thinking. A lot of our teachers and educators, and honestly, like me personally too, haven't been trained in how to do this. And so I think so much of what we rely on in the classroom, certainly what I did when I was teaching high school, you know, we sort of teach in the way that we were taught, broadly speaking. Hopefully we've learned some new things and made some improvements. But if you've never, as a teacher, had exposure to systems thinking, like you not only have to learn it, but then you have to learn how to teach it. And so it is a big challenge. But again, we're thinking big thoughts here today. And so, so if we're going to work towards new ways of thinking, how might we do that? One idea I've had, I really embrace this thought or this conception of adversarial collaboration. And I think so much is just going to be required for us to just shift out of our usual habits and patterns. And so, I don't know, maybe starting in middle school, if there's one assignment per class per year where you pair students up and they have to work together to, whatever, do the assignment, solve the problem, come to a consensus around something where they disagree, then I think it's not explicitly teaching systems thinking or a shift in mental orientation, but I think this kind of thing would open up a lot more mental flexibility if it just got systematized over the long, long arc of people's schooling. And so that's sort of my one of my ideas about how would you teach that. And thinking about how would a journalist do it, even more challenging. How would a CEO do it? Again, I think there are possibilities there. I haven't thought through that space fully, but if that's where we take the conversation towards the end, that would be fascinating. All right, so 2 down, 4 to go. Balancing a need for autonomy and misinformation. So I think the following are some pretty solid educational truisms. So I think it is true that educators should meet learners where they are, right? It's if you start teaching someone up here and they've only learned to this level, it's going to be pretty tricky. But I think it is also true that educators should not propagate misinformation. That is probably not helpful. And so as we think about climate change education, planetary health, it's tricky, right? How do you meet students where they are if they think climate change is not real? And that's simply not the scientific consensus. I think this whole issue gets even trickier because science is this sort of probabilistic thing. So empirical facts are not like a fact that is true everywhere all the time for every single person. It's probabilistic. Science is also self-correcting. So I certainly grew up thinking that like fats were terrible and you should get them out of your diet at all costs. And now it kind of looks more like sugar is probably the most evil villain of the nutrition, at least the stuff that's a regular part of my diet. All right, so gosh, what can we do about this? It'd be great to sort of like embrace the students and where are you? What do you know? What do you think you know? What do you want to learn? But if I have to kind of, as an educator, blow up that foundation and start over, what do I do? Well, I do sort of, again, I'm thinking of in sort of this vein of building habits. And so I want to give a quick little digression to talk about this idea of pre-registration. And so in the research world, increasingly what people are realizing is that research is much better, much more reliable if scientists have to state publicly for the record out there where lots and lots of people could see it. I think X is going to happen. This is the thing I'm going to test. And you put out the exact recipe of like what that test is going to be, what the criteria are for like, yes, I found what I thought I was going to find, or no, I didn't. And so that recipe is so precise and exact that anyone could follow it. So it's like, here's my hypothesis, here's the analysis I'm going to use to test it. So something that sort of conjures up that spirit without waiting for people to be in their PhD program, I think could do wonders for helping this sort of autonomy and misinformation tension and balance. So if we could start that in at much earlier education levels, and especially around sort of public-facing educational efforts, partly just so that people become comfortable being wrong. Like I think it introduces people to science in a really healthy way, and making mistakes and a bad, prediction. I mean, in a lot of places, we might call that learning, which I think is really a good thing, as opposed to the connotation that mistakes usually conjure up. So is this things like English class, right? You could get students to predict the end of the novel and write out a very explicit prediction. And then, lo and behold, a week later, when you finish the book, you find out if it was right or not. Um, offer a rationale for like, I think here's what's going to happen with the economy over the next 3 months, given what's happening in the Middle East right now. Um, gosh, this could be a terrible idea, but prediction markets are clearly becoming a big thing. And so getting students comfortable with sort of making predictions, figuring out ways to really ascertain if those predictions are borne out or not, and being okay with being wrong some of the time. I think the whole rationale for this, in the context of sort of balancing the need for autonomy and misinformation, is I think this is a good way, again, if we do it over time, to get students. I mean, the person that is best equipped to convince any of us of anything is ourselves. And so if they sort of engage in this process where they're like, I think X is going to happen, I have a great test for it that seems fair and reasonable, and lo and behold, X happened or it didn't happen, like that is going to be, I think, most convincing for people. And so that I think can help correct misinformation and sort of the culture around that is involved up, probably better than just about anything else. All right. Emotions and emotion regulation. So we talked about sort of math and test anxiety. Um, in planetary health education, it is a totally different level of anxiety, right? Despair is not a motivating emotion. And as we're going to get to shortly, we do want to think about motivating action. And so, I guess technically noting that the situation is bleak is a subjective statement, but man, the place where the Earth's systems are at right now, I don't know, seems almost like an empirical fact that it's bleak out there. Um, so, how do you do the right balancing of emotions and emotion regulation so that students can still feel some hope and some energy to act? And then it gets even more complicated because learners are really heterogeneous. So there might be a handful of people in your classroom, or if you're the journalist writing an op-ed, a subset of your audience for whom they're not anxious enough. They're not worried. They think it's all going to be fine. And you actually kind of need them to be a little more wound up and animated. And then other people for whom you might be tipping them over the edge and getting them just sort of paralyzed with fear. And so this is kind of the balance, the delicate balance, I think, that a lot of people in the planetary health education space are in. So maybe one answer is to really think about teaching emotion regulation skills fairly explicitly. There's some interesting insights, I think, from psychology that could help us do a better job of that. Maybe the answer is really mixed emotions. So I think a lot of people talk about like, we have to give students hope. We have to give learners a vision of a better world. And I think that's right. But I think also, if we're being honest and sort of high integrity about it, there's probably a little fear involved too. And so, is that a good combination or recipe to motivate action? I don't know. I think educational research in particular could contribute a lot to figuring out if, yeah, maybe in a way that we haven't thought about in the past, really thinking about sort of particular mixes of emotions is the right way to spark motivation. All right. So speaking of motivation, the fifth thing on our list, the sort of these unique characteristics, is really thinking about collective action. And as maybe a quick thought experiment, just recall the courses you've taken at Brown, or if you're coming in from other places. Yeah, of the courses you took, say in undergrad, what proportion do you think of those teachers' courses really expected you to go behave differently like later in the week? Like, because you're learning this stuff in my class, I now want you to have like behaviorally a different set of things that you do this weekend. Um, to me, or at least in my educational background, that was super rare, like almost never. And so I think it is probably fair to say that action or political action in particular, maybe, isn't typically a valued outcome for certainly most courses in K-12 education, but I think that probably persists in higher education as well. Second, and not unrelated issue, is that in this culture, I think there's a lot of pressure for sort of individual evaluation, right? A teacher is going to want to know how Matt did and how I did, because if they can't parse those two things apart, they're going to know that I was freeloading off Matt because, much more energetic than I am. That's not what we want for planetary health education, right? The thing we want out there in the world is students who are motivated to engage in collective action. And so we actually want pressure for action. And I think we want the evaluative mechanism to be much more collective. And so that's, I think, going to require a set of new ideas and new ways to think about delivering education. So how might we do that? I'm actually going to harken back to some really cool stuff back when I was at Harvard with Matt. And this idea of virtual performance assessments, you can go into these virtual environments, often multi-user virtual environments, and navigate around, do like real complicated problem solving sorts of activities. And from those environments, we can separate out and see what I was doing and my contributions, what Matt was doing, his contributions. But we can also assess through these sort of virtual environments how we did together. And so for example, I think the reference on this one is the eco move, where I want to say it was middle school students, but it may have been older, or they may have used a range. They wander into this virtual golf course environment. They find out all the fish in the pond are dead. Question is why? And lo and behold, they have to figure out that actually there's runoff from the golf course, from a fertilizer getting into the stream. Fertilizer runs down into the pond. So much fertilizer that there's a big algae bloom, and all the oxygen disappears because all the algae eat it up. And that's why the fish are dead. They suffocate. So things like that sort of really replicate real world environments that would allow us to, really get some kind of practice at changing our behaviors and thinking through these real world kinds of problems, but also do some collective evaluation and assessment. And then there could be a tack on assignment where they have to like go do some water readings out in their actual local community. All right, last one. So as noted before, the planet's problems are getting worse really, really quickly. These are not easy problems. And at the same time, the planet's problems are absolutely not distributed evenly, right? And so the people that created the problems are not the same people who are reaping the kind of worst repercussions. And so think about like the Marshall Islands, which are about to like disappear completely from flooding. Here in Baltimore, they've got some really interesting shade maps of the city where you can see that the, sort of disproportionately white and middle class neighborhoods have lots of tree and shade cover, and the lower income and more African American neighborhoods, it's a lot more concrete. The entire continent of Africa would be another way to, think about the people who are not causing the problem are the ones who are suffering the most from it. So, how do we develop sort of sophisticated, thoughtful solutions, do it quickly, but then be thoughtful enough that we're also doing it in fair ways? And so Matt may mock me for this, and I'm totally open to that. But here's my foray into economics. So I think there are systems out there where supplementary kind of pricing, where maybe someone or some country who can afford it pays a bit more for, say, solar panels or an electric vehicle. And the additional tax that they pay goes to some fund where the same product or service can be offered for less, specifically for people who've been historically disadvantaged. So, Matt, I have no idea if this is a thing among economists. You can disabuse me of this crazy idea later. But let's actually have me stop talking now. And like, there's a vast, vast terrain that I've mapped out here, and would just love to hear people's thoughts and questions. And thank you so much. I'm really open to take the conversation in any direction at this point.